Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the Vet Partners Town Hall Brief, where we have rich information presented in a very short amount of time. Now, before we get started today, I've got a few items to share. First of all, thank you to our sponsors. We rely on your support and your friendship so much. Thank you. For our listening experience, all lines will be muted so we can focus on our presenters. And we'll stay on mute until the end of the presentation, where we'll open up for questions. And if you have questions, please place them in the questions box. And Elizabeth will watch out for those questions for us. Thank you. Now a bit about today's presentation, our brief. Today's topic, doctor-to-doctor practice sales in the COVID-19 environment. And our presenters, Dr. Karen Felsted has spent the last 20 years working as a financial and operational consultant to veterinary practices and the animal health industry. Now, in 2014, Karen was awarded the Vet Partners Distinguished Life Member Award. How fantastic, Karen.
That means old, I think.
Oh, no, well, congratulations. And David McCormick is a veterinary practice appraiser, management consultant, speaker teacher who specializes in practice ownership issues, including practice financial health, practice value, and ownership entrance exit planning. As a practice appraiser, he is credentialed as a certified valuation analyst. Now, questions to be answered in our brief today. Are sellers still willing to sell? Are buyers willing to buy? It's definitely a changed environment, but sales are still happening. Welcome, Karen and David. The floor is all yours.
Well, we can save a lot of time and just say yes. Things
yes,
still happen.
To both.
That was fun. Thanks.
Come on.
Well, and we wanted to focus on individual practice sales here because there seems to be more information out there about the impact of COVID-19 on the corporate sales, and this is all, you know, obviously a clearly different market there with some different issues that impact it. So we thought this would be a great topic to talk about. We thought we'd start by talking, both David and I, about our individual experiences right now with what we have going on. David, do you want to start?
Yeah, right now, and so some of what I'm sharing is coming from me, but also we had our Simmons national meeting. So for those that don't know me, I'm a part of Simmons Associates. We're national brokers. There's 12 territories across the U.S. I cover the Mid-Atlantic area and Indiana, Ohio, the Great Lakes, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan. I have transactions going on in just about every state on doctor to doctor, as well as the corporates, but we're focusing on doctor to doctor. And in most of these, all but one, I'm representing the seller. So the transactions are happening. I am seeing buyers slow down. I do have some buyers that pre-COVID were very interested in moving forward, but now with everything that happens, they're a little slower. I have some lenders that have either slowed down or increased liquidity requirements. But at the same time, I have offers still coming in. I have offers pending, purchase agreements are circulating, and actually we have 2 closings that should happen here coming up in the next 3 to 4 weeks. So everyone's kind of taking it 1 week at a time, recognizing that things can change rapidly. But overall, those that are wanting to own are still taking action. And I am seeing more sellers valuing their practice. So they're not waiting on this. However, I did have one seller just this week decide that with everything that's happening in the economy, her retirement portfolio, she took her practice off the market to hold on to it for another year and get on the other side of this and let her retirement recover.
So I've got 6 or 7 of these individual transactions going on in various stages. I've probably got roughly half buyers. I'm representing half buyers and half sellers on that. And, you know, Right now, I had one actually close the first week of April. Um, I think the buyers definitely recognize that there's more risk going on now than there was before, but they were far enough into the deal. It's something they really want to do. They think they can manage the risk. So they were willing to go ahead with it, and the bank was still willing to do the financing, which says something right there. I think that, overall, I do think some buyers are appreciating that it's a riskier market now than it was. Other buyers don't really seem to be looking at it that way. I have a little bit of concern that we're in somewhat of a bubble right now in veterinary medicine. While there are definitely practices who are seeing great declines in revenue because they have doctors out or are offering limited services or whatever, there are also practices out there that have some of the strongest growth going on that they've had in years. I'm personally not convinced that that growth level is going to be sustainable over the next year. I personally think it's going to get worse before it gets better. So I think it's very important that buyers understand that this is a riskier environment than it used to be, and also see if they can build something into their contract to try and manage that risk a little bit. But it's still an active market out there.
Yeah, it is. I think one of the things you tapped into on the financing side, what I am seeing, and probably not news to a lot of the folks here, but a lot of the lenders for loans in progress or approaching closing, recognizing the potential instability in the practice, they are adjusting. Instead of payments start in 1 month, maybe they'll put a 6-month freeze on it right from the start, or extend greater working capital or a line of credit as part of this to help the buyer with the transition. So the financing is shifting a little bit, but we still have conventional financing happening, although many of the lenders are still a little swamped with the PPP. And so trying to move a transaction quickly depends on how big the bank is doing the financing.
I had one bank tell me that, where typically they'd quote 60 to 90 days to get everything done, now they're quoting 90 to 120. Not every seller appears to recognize that change is happening. Because, I've got one transaction I'm working on, and the seller's just been insistent that this deal could be done in 45 to 60 days. And I don't think there's a chance in the world that that's going to happen personally, and not through the buyers dragging their feet, but simply because of the financing. I think too that you're seeing a lot more conversations about earnouts being used in individual sales. And at least in my experience, that's been more typical in corporate sales than in individual sales. But so that means, some percentage of the purchase price would be put into escrow, or payment would be delayed on it. And the seller would only get that, whatever, 5 or 10% typically of the purchase price if the practice maintains its revenue. And so that does give some protection to the buyer if we do burst out of this bubble that I think many practices are in right now.
Yeah, I think that earnout component, which it's for me, it's been fairly common in situations where you have a lot of personal goodwill, ambulatory equine or veterinary specialist, and the buyer says, I don't think I'm going to get that goodwill, so I'm going to hold back a portion of the purchase price. If the revenues hit this target, then I'll pay you 12 months later. And so it was very common there. But in the last 2 months, I've seen it definitely come into small animal transactions. I have one I was working on this morning where $200,000 of a $1.5 million purchase is being held back for 12 months. It'll be distributed based on how the practice recovers post closing. So that is one of the ways that we're seeing transactions coming through and shifting a little bit. The other that I'm seeing, and I've had it happen right now in 2, is the return of seller financing. And I say return because fortunately the last 20 years, the veterinary lenders have been jumping right in and writing those checks and financing transactions that are fair market value. we had seller financing, but mostly in a buy-in or a large animal component or a lot of unique goodwill scenarios. But now I have a couple of transactions where seller financing is the way to make it happen. In one, seller financing with a delay in payments. So the folks that want to make the transaction happen, we're still finding ways to make it happen and mitigate the risk.
I think there's a bit of a challenge going on right now because I think most of us are working off of 2019 numbers. You know, if you look at a purchase price estimate that's been done or evaluation or whatever, I mean, you know, those we're still early enough in the year that most of those are based on 2019 numbers. I mean, we really only have a couple of months of what COVID-19 is doing to the market. And I do think some practices are artificially high right now. So, you know, right now from an appraisal standpoint, it's very difficult to say what's the value of a practice at this point. I'm not sure that any of us really know because we don't know. I mean, we have to be in a recession. I mean, you know, technically a recession is 2 quarters of declining growth and we're not through 2 quarters yet, but I mean, we're in the beginnings of a recession. What we don't know is how long the recession is going to last. What's the magnitude going to be? Is there going to be more change on veterinary medicine that we haven't seen yet? And then what's the recovery going to look like? And until we have some feel for that, it's hard to know what the long-term impact on value is going to be. But at a minimum, a buyer has to have some flexibility on, okay, what if revenue is fine now, but in 4 months from now goes down 15%? There's got to be a way of somehow being able to make payments or have deferment from the bank or from, if it's owner financing, have it from the owner. To me, I don't have any concern about the long-term value of practices in veterinary medicine. I think 2 years from now, things are going to look good again, but I'm not completely convinced that, actually, I'm totally not convinced that we're returning to normal this fall. And so, I mean, I think it could be a year or two before we see values come back to what, say, they were in 2019. So there's got to be a way of managing cash flow until we are really over this hump.
Yeah, I want to add on the value component, and certainly in looking at the list of folks here, there's a lot of valuation council members. And so jump in if I'm misstating from our council meetings. But in what we're seeing, and webinars we've attended both within the veterinary evaluation world, but also NACVA and ASA type and evaluation world outside the profession, most appraisers are treating this so far as a temporal anomaly. Not to pull a Star Trek word, but it fits, in that this is a temporary impact. And so we're valuing practices right now as of December 31, 2019. We have that data, and transactions are happening based on that, mitigating some of the risk as we've talked about. The assumption, underlying assumption being that this is temporary, and thus this time next year when we're valuing practices, we are likely to average out, so far based on what we know, average out March, April into May. But the caveat on that is that it's going to depend in a large part to what happens the rest of this year in the veterinary practice. June of this year over June of last year, July of this year over July of last year. Did the practice actually recover? If so, then it truly was a temporal anomaly and it's appropriate to average that out or discount, not in a valuation sense, but drop the significance of 2020. However, if the practice did not, and the nature of the practice changed, then you will see an impact to practice value. And we're going to have to see how this continues to unfold, and everything I just said could be thrown out if, like Karen said, if we end up in a recession and practices are impacted beyond simply the end of March, April. The other comment is that this is very geographic, and some practices and communities have been hit hard, similar to the last recession, and others, it's been business as usual. And that's relative to some of the transactions that we have going on in the vet-to-vet space. If the community's hit hard, then the brakes on the transaction are making a lot more contact than, say, one of the practices that's trucking smoothly along.
I think I totally agree. It's a temporal event, a temporal event. I think it's just the big question is, does that mean just a few months? You know, certainly if you look at some of the vet success data out there, May's looked stronger than March did. But I think I personally think it's going to get worse before it gets better. So, you know, this temporary event could be a year in length. And so are we going to kind of ignore 3 months or 6 months or 9 months or a year's worth of data when we're looking at practice values? I don't think anybody has any idea right now. And that makes it very, very difficult to change valuations at this point because we just don't know. You know, the reason that I'm concerned about the fact that we may see an improvement, and we are seeing certainly wonderful growth rates in some practices, but concerned that that's going to go on is, you know, there's a number of things that are going to happen. PPP money only sustains a practice for 2 months. And so at some point that's up, right? Unemployment benefits don't last forever. Federal subsidies on unemployment benefits aren't going to last forever. You know, we're talking about practices being busy because people are home and they're seeing all this stuff going on with their pet that they're never noticed before, and maybe it's a little easier to take off and visit the vet. Well, at some point, all those lumps and bumps and dentals and stuff, that stuff all gets fixed. You know, that's not necessarily ongoing vet work. And people are talking about, well, shelters got emptied out, so there's all this puppy and kitten work, and that's great too. But at some point, everybody's through those shot series. So that's not necessarily permanent work. And if unemployment obviously continues to climb, then because of all the reasons, or some of the reasons I just talked about there, I have real concerns that we just have not seen the end of this. And, you know, prior to the last recession, veterinary medicine did great. I mean, we just waltzed through recessions, but the last recession hit some practices very hard. There were practices in Florida that were down 30, 40, 50%. I mean, I'm in Texas, and Texas certainly didn't see the impact that some other states did, but they did see an impact, though they saw it later. So definitely geography going on here, in addition to the general situation.
I think so, but even in the last recession, we continued to have transactions. Vet to vet, not just the corporate. And the corporate world's still going strong in those transactions as well. But the vet to vet continued, and I have 5 new listings coming in Virginia, Pennsylvania here today. I'm also getting new buyers that I think were associates. They ended up being furloughed, and they're suddenly realizing, hey, I'm a future owner. So it's still an active market. It's just a little bit slower. Yeah. There's more, if you have clients involved in it, there's a little more to be aware of. There's ways to mitigate some of that risk and the unknowns, because there still are unknowns, heavily influenced by the geography.
That's the biggest piece. No, I agree. I mean, right now I have as many of these transactions going on as I usually do. It's just the riskiness and having some kind of a backup plan if the revenue drops in the next year, and what's the long-term value, and some of that's just unknown at this point. I do think lenders are a little more cautious on, you know, you see some kind of thin transactions that they'll go ahead and be willing to lend on, even if the buyers maybe aren't as strong as one would hope. But, you know, it's been a good economy, practices are growing, there's a lot of potential in the practice. I think lenders are going to be a little more careful on some of those.
Yeah, the first step, they tightened up their liquidity. The buyers had to have a little more cash. Seller notes were a little bit bigger than norm. I did have one lender, a niche lender, not one of the larger players, but they had a veterinary division. They finished the loans that were in progress, but they stopped taking new loans until just this past weekend. So on the conventional side. But for a typical stronger buyer, there's there's not going to be a barrier. But the ones that have a background issue or not a lot of savings or not living within their means, then it could be a little more challenging, and they end up going to the SBA.
Yeah. So
which, of course, the SBA is incredibly busy right now. That's going to put the brakes on a transaction.
So we're at 20 minutes right now, and I know Deb and Elizabeth asked us to make sure that there were times for questions and comments, and so certainly open to questions, but also, as David said, there's a bunch of people here that are also involved in doing transactions too, so I think it'd be interesting to hear any comments about what you think or what you're seeing as well.
This is Deb. Thank you, Karen, for that. I think that's a great idea. I don't see many questions, except I have a comment that I'll share in just a bit. But let's open up to some of our friends here. And are there any additional comments that we could add to the conversation or questions that may have come up along the way?
Well, I will jump in on the comment because I think it's worth recognizing in vet-to-vet transactions. The lack of knowing must be driving veterinarians with their wanting to be in control a little bit crazy. And if you are working with a client that's planning an exit or an entrance right now, it becomes, in my experience, even more important to be flexible. That if it's going to be my way or the highway type one-sided transaction, then it could be a really bumpy road. But if both parties are recognizing, hey, we can work together. If you want to sell and I want to buy, we can find a way to make it work and make it work in this environment. But we have to work together for it.
You know, that's an interesting comment because of the transactions that I have, there's a couple where we're struggling to find a middle ground on price. But you know what? This doesn't have anything to do with COVID. We haven't even gotten to COVID because we're all looking at 2019 prices at this point. But it's just an expectation, at least from the buyer side, that the seller is a little optimistic in what they want for their practice. And we're struggling with 2019 practice numbers on that. And then all of a sudden you get the risk of COVID. So, I mean, that willingness on both sides is, I mean, that's always critical.
There's another comment, are we seeing the PP money impacting sales? And the only thing I'm seeing right now is just the timing of the closing. We're making sure the closing happens 8 weeks after they receive the money as far as setting a target, so that we're kind of keeping the seller set in their data going forward.
And a lot of times that's going to work out anyways,
right,
because of the time frame on the financing and that kind of stuff. I mean, most people now have already received their PPP money, so the clock's already started ticking on that. If you get a new sale and it's taking, you know, the lender 60 to 90 days. But yeah, you don't want to close certainly not in the middle of that time frame.
We'll give a plug for Glenn because I know he's there with his little picture. But just
well,
I want to express appreciation on behalf of everyone for all the work that he and the team are doing. If you're not on his mailing list for the PPP updates, you know, it's definitely keeping me informed.
Thank you.
Thank you here too, and he's done a number of webinars on this topic too. So there's a fair amount of information from Vet Partners members out there on this.
Okay, we've got quite a group of friends with us today. Any other comments we have before we call our brief to an end for the day? All right.
This is
Karen.
This is Jim Rimmer. Can I?
Hi, Jim.
May I make a comment and ask a quick question?
Yes.
The world still seems to be that the sellers are hanging their hat on 2019 numbers, and some of the buyers I'm seeing, both corporate and individual, are spending a lot more time focusing on what's happening right now. So I think that's just kind of a never-ending buyer-seller conundrum. But I guess the question I have for Karen and David is, what do you think the likelihood is of the major lenders doing 100% financing loans on acquisitions that they are helping buyers complete?
Looking at the 6 transactions I have on my board, which is right behind there.
Let's see 'em.
One, yeah, we'll turn that around. One does have 100% financing. The others have significant seller participation. Now, most of these, I would say 2/3 of those were already rolling forward before this hit. The new ones, I am seeing higher seller notes. So instead of the normal, yes, you always have 20% on the real estate side and 100% on the practice, often depending on the loan to value. But now I am starting to see 10, 15%, in talking with another lender, 20% of the practice side in a seller note.
Yeah, my situation would
Can I
be
ask one other
similar.
oh, excuse me. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say my situation would be similar. I will say I've got one where the lender has been saying 100% financing all along, but it's very early stages of underwriting, and I guess I'm not overly confident that's going to hold.
Yeah. Can I just have one other follow-up quick question? So that you raised the topic about timing the PPP money versus issues of a sale and the timing of the sale. And so this is a debate that we've been having in a couple of other settings that I'm involved with right now. Is should the seller focus on using up the PPP money or focus on getting the practice sold? And there's kind of a different dynamic at play in several that I'm working on. But to me, that is a really pretty interesting question. And it certainly depends on the circumstances in each case. But you know, people want to use up the money, but they also want to sell their hospital. So there's this kind of debate, this juggling act is, you know, how can we accomplish, are we taking a risk if we try to accomplish both? And so I'd be interested in hearing what you're thinking about that. Are you in the middle of any right now where you're trying to navigate the timing of the two?
I am not. No, it's not an issue for any of the ones I have.
No, I would say the same. And I guess, I mean, part of it is if you want your PPP money forgiven, you better make sure you spend it on acceptable stuff, because you've only got the 8-week time frame, at least as of now, unless Congress changes that, right? But I also, and like you said, Jim, there's always going to be individual situations, but to some extent, a lot of the goals are similar, right? I mean, you want to keep revenue coming in. You need people to be at the hospital to service that revenue, to take care of those clients. But understand it's not always quite that simple. I did want to say one other thing, and I think, Jim, it was something you said just a few minutes ago. One of the things that I've noticed with buyers is the buyers that I'm working with seem to be a little bit split. I think there's a certain number of buyers right now who are working in practices that are very busy, and I'm not completely convinced that they get the risk, the potential risk going forward. And then I have a few others who are definitely getting it and wanting to negotiate an earnout or some kind of lower price or something like that. But I do think there's some buyers who just who don't really appreciate what it could look like.
Yeah, I'll jump in there if we're going to stereotype buyers. The ones I'm seeing that's parallel or a different shift on that. If the buyer has been looking for a practice, they've been on my list for 5-8 years, they're moving full steam ahead. They want the practice. They understand. They've been preparing. They're more knowledgeable anyway because they've looked at 8-10 practices. The newer future owners they've looked at one practice or two, and this is or their first, they're much more sensitive to. Now, they're still all hiring good advisors, it seems, which is great. But the newer the buyer, the more sensitivity they seem to have.
Does anyone know if the PPP loans could be assumed by a buyer that was acquired by the seller?
That's a good question. I do not know.
They cannot.
That's right.
Say that again?
They cannot.
What was the answer?
They can't.
Okay.
And that's
I
why
didn't think so, but I just thought I'd ask.
That's why you want to be through the whole PPP thing.
Yeah.
Hey, Glenn, do you want to comment too? Because I thought last time we had a conversation about this, there was also some concern about what happens if you get through the 8-week period. That's just when the money has to be used, but it could be months before it's formally forgiven. Glenn, what's the current thinking on that?
Well, the House bill, the House bill is extending it to December 31st. So it's, who knows?
Right.
I mean, the Senate bill is 16 weeks. The House bill is 24 weeks. So to use the money. So, and they're extending the full-time equivalent, bringing back if you get your forgiveness cut by the full-time forgiveness or by the full-time equivalent numbers, they're extending that out rather than have to bring them back by June 30th. They're talking about December 31st. And so every hospital is different. If they spend the money and keep their people, they're going to either 16 or 24 weeks, either one, everybody's going to get full forgiveness. But they could spend all their money and use it as hazard pay or bonuses or whatever you want to call it and lose people and still get some of it not forgiven. So, you know, we don't have any that are in that, just like you guys said, there's nobody that's in that window now of trying to close. You know, I think if they were that close to closing, they shouldn't have taken the PPP money anyway, would have been my recommendation. But everybody that we have, whether it's 16 weeks or 24 weeks, we're not going to close in that window anyways. That's kind of a moot point.
Glenn, thank you for contributing. And before we sign off, Kent, pardon, you're up. Do you have a question?
Oh, I just had a comment. I'm in Tennessee, so we have about 100 to 200 veterinarians that we finance. So what we're seeing with a couple of notes on the triple P is it affects your underwriting when I have doctors that are buying other practices. What we didn't realize coming into this, and we've probably done $25 to $30 million worth of triple Ps, about 4 months, 4.5 months worth of work. I think pretty much free for the U.S. government in about 3.5 weeks. So it killed our staff. But anyway, the underwriting piece of the triple P is what was one of the things that in every morning, basically at 10 o'clock and 2:30 in the afternoon, we were having virtual Zoom meetings with Atlanta and literally making up the rules as we went here through SBA, which is a different topic altogether. But as we've had some of the guidance come down recently, for example, I've got 3 deals working right now where I have doctors that own multiple clinics, and now we're having to go back and re-underwrite because that triple P is going to be that's counted as a loan before the forgiveness piece. So we're mandated through the Federal Reserve and OCC to underwrite that as if it is a current loan. Forget the forgiveness piece. But the big kicker is it's also, even though the Congress voted on a 10-year payback, the SBA legal language was 24 months. So now you have to underwrite that as a loan that's hitting your cash flow on a 24-month payment period, and that ouches on some of the bigger ones. But anyway, that's kind of a comment on triple P. So we're having to push some of those back. Timing, we are having moved slow, mainly because of getting appraisers. People are not working, didn't want to work, or it's hard to get them through the COVID-19. So you're finding, city zoning meetings, trying to get zoning things changed, or making sure, all the government underwriting and pieces, all the T's were crossed and the I's were dotted, and it's just taking a lot longer. So that's the reality of it. My personal 2 cents on the financial side, I kind of tend to want to err on the cautious side. I agree with Karen. We're not convinced that this thing is going to rebound back in a V that a lot of folks would like to see. If it's more like a long check mark, but we will eventually come out. The glass half full side is very interesting. Glenn, I very much appreciate the data you've been putting out, our 84 clinics that I've been tracking in Tennessee. It may wind out, and I'm very optimistic that indeed it's highly likely that it will give just some proof to why we have so much venture capital money interested in veterinary medicine. If we come out of this thing in a year or so looking back and we may be somewhat quote unquote recession proof, it may attract another group of money. So if we come out we're going to be a lot better than the restaurant and the hotel industry. I guarantee that. But anyway, that's kind of my 2 cents, guys.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I tell you what, Karen and David, thank you so much for really starting off this great, interesting conversation. And thank you all for all your contributions as well. So it's so interesting. And what I'm hearing, the essence is that things are constantly changing and we have a lot of unknown, and we'll all get through the other side one way or the other. So thank you for your insight, because it helps everybody make decisions. Thank you for all that you do. If anyone has any more questions about this particular topic or other questions concerning Vet Partners, please email admin@vetpartners.org. That's admin@vetpartners.org. Thanks again so much to our sponsors. We can't do so many things without you and your support. Thank you. And the recording of this session will be on our website next week. And stay tuned for future Vet Partners Town Hall briefs coming your way soon. And we've got quite a lineup, so stay tuned. Thank you all for tuning in and for all that you do for the veterinary profession. Until next time, stay healthy, stay happy, stay safe. Thank you all.
Thanks, Seth.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.